Don't touch them, the woman said. She stepped between the rider and the two children huddled beside a cold iron stove, one hand braced on the table, as if her body alone could keep the whole room standing. Her hair had come loose in the night. Flour streaked one sleeve. There was blood at the corner of her mouth, fresh enough to shine. Take me if that's what you came for, she said, voice steady though the little girl behind her was shaking hard enough to rattle the chair. But feed the children first. The room held still after that. Even the sheriff stopped jingling his cuffs. Gideon Vale stood in the doorway with the morning biting through his coat and the smell of his own saddlebag biscuits rising warm against the raw cold. Behind him, frost silvered the yard around the creekside mill, and the wheel that had once turned day and night now sat frozen like a shut eye. Deputy Harlan Pike had already read out the foreclosure notice. Silas Rusk's two riders had already started looking around the house, as if hunger itself could be inventoried. But that plea, plain and stripped down to bone, landed harder than any threat Gideon had heard in years. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight, and tell us in the comments what patch of the world you're listening from. Stories like this travel best from one quiet room to another, and we always like knowing who's sitting by the fire with us. Then Gideon crossed the room, set his rifle against the wall, and unwrapped the blue cloth from his saddlebag. 6 biscuits, still warm from the Dutch oven he had banked before dawn. He laid them on a plate as carefully as if he were setting down church silver. The boy didn't reach first. He looked to his mother. The little girl pressed both fists to her mouth to keep herself from crying at the smell. Eat, Gideon said. The woman's eyes lifted to his then, sharp and distrustful and exhausted clean through. She was older than he had guessed from the file Rusk handed him. Not old in years. Old in the way grief lays a hand on a face and doesn't remove it. There a price on those? She asked. There isn't. The sheriff snorted. Plenty of price on this place. Deputy Pike was one of those men who always looked damp, even in dry weather. He kept worrying at the brim of his hat with thick fingers. Mara Quill, he said, tapping the notice against his palm. By authority of the county and in collection of debt lawfully assigned to Mr. Silas Rusk, this mill, the house, the equipment, the grain storage, and all attached water rights are to be surrendered this morning. Mara didn't look at him. She broke a biscuit in half and gave the larger piece to the little girl. County didn't lend me seed, she said. County didn't bury my husband. County didn't keep the wheel turning when the creek fell low. This is Mr. Rusk talking through your mouth. One of Rusk's riders, Cleet Danner, smiled at that. He had a white scar splitting one eyebrow and the easy meanness of a man who preferred women frightened. Mouths bold for someone with no deed by noon. She's got till I finish reading, Pike said. You finished 3 minutes ago, Gideon muttered. Pike shot him a look. Gideon ignored it and watched the children eat like creatures that had learned not to trust a full plate. The boy, maybe 10, tried to nibble slow for his sister's sake. The little girl, no more than 6, burned her fingers and still did not let go. Gideon had seen that kind of hunger before. He had never once forgotten it. Outside, hooves sounded on the hard ground. Nobody in that room needed telling who rode that smooth or early. Silas Rusk entered without knocking, carrying cold in with him and something worse besides. He wore city boots in ranch country, polished black, and a dark wool coat with not one loose thread on it. He never hurried. Men with real power seldom do. Ms. Quill, he said, as if calling at a social hour. I hope we might end this with less theater. There are children in this house, she said. That makes it a theater only if you brought an audience. Rusk's smile did not change, but his eyes went flat. Your husband owed me. My husband signed for a season's bridge note, Mara said. You turned it into a claim on the whole creek. Your husband failed to read the terms. My husband knew how to read just fine. What he failed to understand was how crooked you write. Cleet barked a laugh and then cut it short when Rusk tipped his head the slightest fraction. The boy, Ben, straightened in his chair. Gideon noticed it. The child was frightened, yes, but he had that thin, hot look boys get when they've been standing in for the dead too long. Rusk moved his gaze to the silent mill wheel outside the window. That's a shame, he said. Good sight. Strong water when managed properly. There's a rail spur survey coming west next year. Flour contracts will be worth real money. A woman alone can't manage what's coming. And you can't buy it honestly, Mara said. So here you are. Rusk nodded once at Pike. Take possession. Ben pushed back from the table so fast the chair skidded. You leave our mill be. Cleet took one step toward him. Mara moved before Gideon did. She caught the long grain scoop from the hearth and leveled it like a spear. I said don't touch them. For one stretched second, nobody breathed. The little girl whimpered. Pike reached for the cuffs on his belt. Rusk looked almost bored, which Gideon had come to understand was the most dangerous look on him. Then Cleet lunged. Mara swung the scoop and clipped his cheek hard enough to draw a red line. He cursed and grabbed for her wrist. Ben launched himself at the man's side with all the fury a hungry child could find. Pike surged forward. Gideon moved at last, catching Cleet by the collar and slamming him back into the doorframe, so the whole house shuddered. That's enough, Gideon said. Rusk's voice came quiet. Are you forgetting who pays you? No, Gideon said. I'm remembering what I was told this morning. Collect papers. Clear the house. You didn't say anything about a child getting trampled. Rusk studied him. The room seemed to tighten around that look. Very well, he said at last. No trampling. He turned to Mara. You and your children have 1 hour. After that, the house is mine. The wheel is mine. The creek is mine. If you force a public disturbance, the county poor farm will take the children, and you can work your debt out in my hotel kitchen in Abilene until you're gray. The threat hit harder than a slap. Mara's face changed, but only by a breath. That was the first unanswered thing that caught in Gideon's ribs. Not whether she feared for herself. She plainly did not. It was the single flash of terror when Rusk named the poor farm. The second thing came a moment later, when her eyes cut, just once, not to the door or the window or the children, but to the flour bin by the wall. Gideon saw it. He said nothing. Rusk tipped his hat and walked out. Pike followed. Cleet wiped blood from his cheek and gave Mara a look that promised trouble before sundown. Gideon stayed long enough to pick up his rifle. You've got 1 hour, he said, because he did not yet know what else to give her. Mara's chin came up. And if I need more? He looked past her to the cold stove, the empty shelf, the blue shadows under the children's eyes. Hide whatever you can't afford him finding, he said softly. Then be ready. He stepped outside before either of them could answer. The yard smelled of wet timber and old grain. The mill loomed over the creek, broad-shouldered and wounded, with one spoke missing from the outer wheel and a black scar up the side where somebody had once tried to fire the place and failed. Gideon had noticed that too, though nobody had written it in Rusk's file. Pike was spitting tobacco into the frost. Cleet sat his horse one-handed, still dabbing at his face. You took your sweet time in there, Pike said. Gideon cinched his saddlebag shut. Children were eating. Children eat at the poor farm too, Cleet said. Then maybe you ought to go test it. Cleet's hand dropped toward his holster. Pike shifted between them with a curse. Save it. Rusk wants them moved to town, not buried in the yard. That was the first time Gideon heard it said plain. Not just turned out. Moved to town. Delivered. He turned slowly. Town. Pike shrugged. Rusk says the widow can scrub pots to settle the rest. Better than jail. Is that what she signed for? Cleet smiled without humor. Since when did papers matter more than orders? Gideon looked toward the house again. Through the clouded window, he could see Mara kneeling by the flour bin, the little girl clutching her shoulder, the boy watching the door like a half-starved dog that had learned too early where danger came from. An hour later, Mara came out with one carpet bag, one bedroll, a tin box hugged to her chest, and both children wrapped against the cold in coats too thin for the season. Gideon had already hitched the wagon. Pike seemed relieved not to do the hauling himself. Cleet looked cheated of something he had hoped for. Mara lifted Ben up first, then the little girl, Elsie. She turned to climb in after them when Pike caught her elbow. Wrist out, he said. Procedure. Before Mara could pull free, Gideon spoke. No cuffs. Pike blinked. What? She's not running on foot with 2 children and a tin box. She clipped a hired man. Cleet touched the cut on his cheek with theatrical delicacy. Near murdered me. Gideon met Pike's eyes. No cuffs. Maybe it was the flatness in his voice. Maybe it was the memory of what his fists could do when pressed. Pike swore and let go. Mara climbed into the wagon without thanking anybody. Gideon did not expect thanks. He climbed to the seat and flicked the reins. They had not gone half a mile along the creek road before the boy whispered, Ma. Mara looked down. Ben had one hand inside the tin box. He drew out not silver, not keepsakes, but a wrapped ledger no bigger than a family Bible, bound in oilcloth. From the flour bin, Ben said. Like Pa told me. Mara shut her eyes. Gideon kept his gaze on the road, though every nerve in him had gone alert. Your husband left instructions? Drive, Mara said. He did. But he had the feeling the real story had only just climbed into the wagon with them. They reached the stone crossing where the creek narrowed and ran hard between banks of scrub oak. The wagon wheels jolted over the first shelf of rock. Then a rifle cracked from the rise above. The mule screamed. It pitched sideways, harness snapping tight, and the whole wagon lurched toward the drop. Elsie cried out. Ben grabbed for his sister. Mara threw herself across them as the tin box flew from her lap. Gideon hauled on the reins, but the mule was already going down. Another shot punched dust by the wheel. From the ridge came Cleet's laugh, sharp as broken glass. Move, Gideon roared. He jumped from the seat onto the near shaft, cut the traces with one slash of his knife, and drove his shoulder against the wagon as the dead weight of the mule dragged it toward the edge. The wheel hung over open water. The box skidded, hit a rock, and burst open in a scatter of papers. Mara didn't reach for the papers first. She shoved Ben toward Elsie and braced both arms against the seat to keep them from sliding out. Her boots slipped in the frost. Her palms bled at once. A third shot rang out. Gideon saw the flash on the ridge and fired back without aiming pretty. He heard a curse, bought himself one breath. Two. Enough to wrench the wagon backward half an inch. Then another, until the wheel dropped hard onto stone instead of air. The creek roared beneath them. Elsie sobbed into Mara's coat. Ben was already scrambling down to gather the blown papers before the water took them. Leave them, Gideon shouted. No, Mara shot back and jumped after him. That was the point of no return, though none of them knew it yet. Not the foreclosure, not the threat, not even the wagon tipping over the creek. It was the sight of that woman on bloodied hands and knees in the freezing wind, chasing papers through the mud while bullets still clipped the rocks around her, because whatever lay written there mattered more than her own skin. Gideon covered them until the firing stopped. When he looked up again, the ridge was empty. Cleet had ridden off. Mara stood with the rescued papers clutched to her chest, breathing smoke into the cold, hair wild around her face. He meant to kill us, Ben said. Gideon stared at the empty rise. Yes. Was that your boss's order? Mara asked. He could have lied. Easier men would have. I wasn't told, he said. But I know who profits if you drown. She held his gaze a long time, then looked to the children. We don't go to Abilene, she said. We don't go to town. Not with him waiting. No, Gideon said. You don't. The words were out before he had settled the cost of them in his own mind. There was an old line shack 6 miles north, tucked in cedar brakes on land Rusk hadn't yet swallowed because the soil was mean and the spring ran iron. Gideon took them there by dusk with the wagon half broken and one wheel singing. He built the fire, fixed the axle, and set beans to simmer while Mara dried the papers by the hearthstone one sheet at a time. Ben slept sitting up with a rifle across his knees until his chin dropped to his chest. Elsie curled beneath a coat with biscuit crumbs still at one corner of her mouth. At last Mara opened the oilcloth ledger and turned it toward the light. It wasn't a debt book. It was a mill book. Weights, names, bushel counts, delivery dates, marks against shipments sent east and west. And besides some entries, in Jonah Quill's steady hand, small notations, short by 3 sacks. Pike witnessed false seal. Rusk note altered after signing. Widow Hale overcharged 12%. Keep duplicates. Gideon felt the fire pop in his bad shoulder like a warning. Your husband knew, he said. Mara nodded without looking up. Jonah knew Mr. Rusk was stealing from every farmer who brought grain through this creek. Shaved the scale. Altered bridge notes. Took deeds for debt those men had already paid. Why didn't he go to the sheriff? She laughed once, low and joyless. The sheriff was the one holding the seal. Gideon thought of Pike's damp fingers worrying his hat brim. Thought of the rail spur survey Rusk had mentioned. Suddenly the mill, the creek, the hunger in that house. All of it widened into something meaner than one widow's misfortune. This wasn't a foreclosure. It was a clearing. Rusk meant to own the valley before the railroad came. Mara turned another page. Jonah hid this the week before he died. Rusk's version of Jonah Quill's death was simple enough. A fall from the upper catwalk while repairing the wheel in storm season. But Gideon had worked enough ranch and freight lines to know when a story had too tidy a shape. He didn't fall, did he? He said. Mara's hand stilled on the paper. They said he did. She drew a breath that dragged. But Jonah came home that night with dirt under his nails and a boot print on his coat. 3 ribs were broken before he ever hit the ground. Gideon sat very still. He asked me for one thing before the fever took him, she went on. He asked me not to let our children be raised on stolen bread. The beans simmered. The wind pressed at the chinks in the shack. Ben made a small sound in his sleep and tightened his hand around the empty rifle stock. Mara closed the ledger. You should leave, she said. That's the easy answer. It's the safe one. He looked at the children, then at the ledger, then at the woman who had chosen papers over her own life on a freezing creek bank because truth was all she had left to trade with. Safe for who? For you, she said. Rusk owns half this county and rents the other half. Men like him don't lose to widows. Men like him lose when everybody finally sees the same thing at once. And who is going to show them? You. That should have been the place. He laughed and walked out. Instead, he heard himself say, maybe. She shook her head. You work for him. I worked for him. He stood and went to the door, bracing one hand on the frame. Night had fallen hard outside. Somewhere down the dark draw, a coyote lifted its voice. There's a clerk in Dry Hollow keeps duplicate filings for transport taxes, he said. There's a blacksmith in town, Isaiah Bell, who owes me a favor and hates Rusk on principle. There's a widow named Ada Loon who hears more than preachers do because people talk freely around women they've already decided don't matter. If your husband kept one ledger, there may be 2. If there are 2, there's a pattern. If there's a pattern, there's a noose even a bought sheriff can't cut. Mara studied him. Why? It was a fair question. It sat between them like a stone. He looked down at the flour dust still clinging to his sleeve from her kitchen floor. Because a hungry child doesn't care whether the thief wears gloves or a judge's ribbon, he said. Stolen is stolen. That was the first line she seemed to believe. Morning brought the hard kind of work that steadies frightened people. Gideon chopped kindling. Mara mended the broken strap on Ben's boot with harness thread. Elsie shelled the last of the dried peas into a tin cup with the solemn care of a saint arranging candles. By noon, Gideon had ridden to Dry Hollow and back with a sack of flour from Isaiah Bell's wife, a coil of fence wire, and news. Rusk had spread the word that Mara Quill attacked a hired man, stole bank property, and fled county process. Pike had posted notice at the mercantile. Anyone aiding her could be charged the same. Community's talking, Gideon said, setting the flour down. Half of them are scared. Half of them are angry. Most can't afford the luxury of choosing which. Mara wiped her hands on her skirt. And your friend Isaiah? Shooing a team when I came through. Never looked up. Kept tapping the same nail till I said the creek road was washed out. And that meant that he'll meet us tonight by the old lime kiln. She nodded once. That was all. There are moments in a story where you can feel the hinges turning. This was one of them. If you'd been in that shack then, with a warrant on the wall in town and 2 children listening to grown people pretend not to be afraid, what would you have done? Would you have taken the children and vanished in a safer country? Or would you have trusted a man tied to your enemy because he set down biscuits when he might have set irons? Tell us true in the comments, because this is the kind of choice that says more about a person than any speech ever will. That night Isaiah Bell came by the kiln with his beard full of forged sparks and a habit of rubbing his thumb over the notch in his wedding ring when lying seemed likely. Clerk's office got tossed, he said. Not robbed. Tossed. Files broken open. Anything with transport weights from Quill Mill missing. Mara's jaw tightened. He knows about the ledger. Or suspects. Isaiah handed her a wrapped bundle. Inside lay a brass seal press blackened by old ink. County wheat levy. Found this under my back step at dawn. Pike's wife buys nails from me. I reckon her husband dropped it during one of his private rounds. Gideon swore softly. A stolen seal. Altered notes. Missing records. It was bigger than they had hoped, and uglier too. Isaiah looked at Gideon then. You riding with them now? I am. Then you'll want to say the rest before she hears it from me. Mara went still. Gideon felt the old shame rise in him like creek water over boots. Say what? She asked. He pulled in a breath he did not want. The week Jonah died, Rusk sent me with a notice for him. Just a notice? I found him at the mill after dark, arguing with Pike. Jonah had a paper in his hand and blood on his mouth. Pike said it was a domestic matter between creditor and debtor. I left. Isaiah shut his eyes. Mara stared at Gideon as if the room had dropped from under her. You left him. I did. Why? Because he had already buried a wife. Because his little girl had fever and he needed wages. Because men tell themselves 10 cowardly stories to make one cowardly act seem practical. He said the ugliest truth of it. Because I thought staying out of another man's fight might be the only way to keep bread in my own child's hand. Mara did not slap him. That would have hurt less. She simply turned away. Isaiah cleared his throat. There's more. Rusk's riding for the mill tomorrow night with Danner and 3 others. If he can't find the ledger, he'll burn the place proper and call it mercy. Mara faced them again, and grief had burned clean into resolve. Then we get there first. Too dangerous, Gideon said at once. She lifted the brass seal. My husband died, keeping proof. My children nearly went over a creek for it. Mr. Vale, danger stopped being a useful argument yesterday morning. They rode under a moon bright enough to silver the cactus spines. Ben and Elsie stayed hidden with Ada Loon in the church root cellar beyond town, because even Mara knew not every battle is faced with children at your knees. The road to the mill smelled of cedar and cold limestone. Gideon rode ahead, listening for hoofbeats. None came. That worried him more than if he had heard 20. Inside the mill the dark felt inhabited. Mara moved like a person who knew every board by sound. She went not to the office, not to the bins, but to the dead wheel's inner gear house. Jonah built a false hub, she whispered. Said no thief ever thinks what can keep a secret. She slid her hand beneath the gear brace and found an iron latch hidden under grease. The panel shifted. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, lay a packet of duplicate transport receipts, 2 altered bridge notes with Rusk's signatures layered over erasures, a survey map showing the railroad spurs skirting the Quill Creek bed, and a small photograph of Jonah with Ben as a baby on his shoulders. Mara touched the photograph once with 2 fingers. Then she put it away. From outside came the scrape of a boot. Gideon spun. Down, he hissed. Gunfire exploded through the plank wall. Lantern light shattered. Mara dove behind the meal chest as splinters drove across the floor. Cleet's voice rang from the yard. Found you, widow. Gideon fired through the gap and heard one hoarse scream. Men scattered. Another shot tore across his upper arm and slammed him into the grain chute. He bit back the sound. Mara was already moving. Fast in crisis, faster than fear. She dragged the receipts into the wax cloth, shoved them inside her coat, and caught up the iron hook used for feed sacks. They want the papers, Gideon said through his teeth. Then they don't get them. The back door burst inward. Cleet came through first, smoke swirling around him, pistol high. Mara swung the hook low and caught his wrist. The gun discharged into the ceiling. Grain dust rained down. Gideon hit Cleet from the side hard enough to send both men crashing into the bolter frame. Run, Gideon shouted. Mara ran. Not away. Up. She took the stair to the catwalk 2 at a time, knowing exactly where the floor narrowed and the rafters dipped. Outside, more riders dismounted. Rusk himself stepped into the yard below, lantern in one hand, smooth as Sunday. He had brought no haste with him. Only certainty. You should have signed, he called up. Mara stood above the wheel shaft, hair blown loose, blood on one sleeve, the waxed packet hidden under her coat. You should have learned to steal from men who can't count. Rusk smiled. This was never about counting. It was about timing. Then Gideon saw what Mara saw. Along the lower wall, beneath the meal room, oil had already been thrown. Rusk lifted the lantern. Gideon lunged, but Cleet caught his injured arm and drove him to one knee. The lantern sailed in a low arc, struck the soaked boards, and fire ran like an animal set free. Smoke punched upward at once. Mara vanished into it. Gideon heard the old timbers catch, heard Cleet laugh, heard Rusk say almost gently, "That concludes Quill Mill." Then something changed inside the fire. A great mechanical groan rolled through the building. Deep, wet, alive. Mara Quill had not run toward the catwalk for height. She had run for the sluice chain. The mill race gate, unused for weeks, shrieked as it opened. Cold creek water slammed through the channel beneath the wheel, hit the stalled paddles, and forced the great black circle to turn a quarter, then another. Water burst upward through the maintenance grates and sheeted across the lower floor. Steam exploded. Fire recoiled. Cleet cursed and stumbled back as a torrent swept grain, ash, and a burning barrel across the room into his legs. Mara came down through the smoke like judgment itself, coughing hard, dress hem blackened, one hand on the chain, the other gripping the iron hook. She swung once and drove Cleet into the flooded wall. Gideon tore free and fired. Cleet dropped. Rusk had already backed out into the yard. For one suspended instant he and Mara faced each other through the open mill door, fire hissing behind her, water rushing underfoot, smoke writhing up around the half-turned wheel. Then he raised his pistol at her heart. Gideon shot first. The bullet took Rusk high in the shoulder and spun him hard, but did not drop him. He ran for his horse, mounted clumsily one-handed, and vanished into the dark with his remaining men. Gideon took 2 steps after him and nearly went down from blood loss. Mara caught him before he hit the boards. That was where movement 3 of their lives should have ended, in the choking dark of a half-burned mill with the villain escaped, and the proof saved, but not yet enough. Instead life, as it often does, demanded one more cruel turn. From the yard behind them came Ben's voice. "Ma!" Mara froze. Ben and Elsie, white-faced and trembling, stood with Ada Loon by the fence. Ada must have moved them when she heard riders. The children had seen smoke and come anyway. Rusk, half-mounted and wild with pain, wheeled his horse back 1 desperate yard, snatched Ben by the coat collar as the boy lunged toward the mill, and dragged him up against the saddle. "Bring me the packet," Rusk called, voice ragged now, "or I take the boy and every page with him." Mara went still as winter water. Gideon tried to raise his rifle and could not. The whole world narrowed to the boy's terrified breath and the black mouth of Rusk's gun against his temple. Mara took 1 step forward, then another, and ended there, empty hands at her sides, smoke lifting around her face while every soul in that yard waited to see whether a mother would trade justice for her child. At first light, they were hiding in the old limestone cut beneath the north bank, a place Jonah once used to store ice blocks in summer. The packet lay dry inside Mara's coat. Ben slept with his head in Ada Loon's lap, alive and whole, because when Mara took those 2 steps forward, she had not surrendered the packet. She had spoken. "Ben," she had said, her voice carrying steady over the roar of the mill race. "Drop." The boy had obeyed at once. That was his mother's true skill, perhaps more than numbers or grain or gears. She had raised children who trusted her enough to fall when falling was all that could save them. Ben dropped clear of the saddle. Rusk fired wild. Ada yanked Elsie down. Gideon, on one knee and nearly blind with pain, shot the horse out from under him. Rusk escaped on foot into the scrub. But he escaped without the boy, without the packet, and without the last of his dignity. Now the cave smelled of wet stone, blood, and coffee Ada had somehow found time to boil in a dented pot. Mara sat with Gideon's coat off and his shirt peeled from the wound in his arm. She threaded a needle over the lantern. Her hands no longer shook. "This will hurt," she said. "It already does." "Good. Then you won't notice the difference." He might have smiled if he'd had spare strength for it. She cleaned the wound with whiskey first. He swore into his sleeve. Ben, awake now, watched from across the cave mouth with solemn fury. Elsie slept curled against Ada, one grubby fist still tucked in the blue biscuit cloth Gideon had given her sometime before dawn. Mara stitched in silence for a while. The quiet between them had changed. It was no longer distrust. Not forgiveness either. Something less comfortable and more honest. At last she said, "Why the biscuits?" He knew at once what she meant. Not why he carried food. Why warm biscuits always? Why the careful cloth? Why he had gone white at the sight of children, trying not to look hungry. He kept his eyes on the cave roof. "My daughter liked them with sorghum if we had it, plain if we didn't. Her name was Lottie." The words came slow, old and rusted. "She was 5. The winter fever took my wife. I signed on to a freight outfit after that. Thought wages would save us. Left Lottie with my sister 3 weeks while I ran a luxury load south for a man richer than God and meaner than drought. Storm pinned us in a wash. By the time I got back, my sister had buried the child." Mara's hands stopped against his skin. "I'd promised her," he said. "Promised I'd come back with flour and sugar and a blue ribbon for her hair. Came home with all 3. Set them on a table that had nobody left to eat at it." No one in the cave moved. After a long while Mara tied off the stitch and sat back. "Jonah's last meal was half a biscuit and chicory coffee," she said softly. "He kept trying to give the biscuit to Ben. Said he wasn't hungry. Men say foolish things when they think love sounds better than the truth. She looked toward the children. The truth was he wanted them to remember a father who fed them, not one who failed. Gideon turned his head. Her face in the lantern light looked worn open, all the guarded edges gone for one dangerous moment. I begged them to feed the children first, she said. Not because I thought they had mercy in them, because I could not bear for that to be the memory they carried into the rest of their lives. Men taking me, their stomachs empty, the smell of nothing cooking. He swallowed. Mara. She shook her head. I know what it sounds like. Small, compared to murder and land theft and all the rest. No, he said. It sounds like the whole thing. Something flickered across her face then, some recognition deeper than comfort. He reached for the blue cloth in Elsie's sleeping hand, took it gently, and folded it once. Grief is just love with no place to set the table, he said. That's all it ever was. Mara's mouth trembled, not into a smile, into the shape a person makes when they are close to breaking and decide, for once, not to stop it. She covered his hand with hers. If that landed somewhere tender in you, you are exactly who we tell these stories for. And if you want more stories where broken people still find a way to build something worth staying for, a like and a subscribe is the quietest good way to let us know. Ada cleared her throat with theatrical delicacy and announced she was taking the children outside to inspect whether the dawn had remembered how to behave itself. Ben rolled his eyes like a grown man and followed her. Elsie, half asleep, carried the blue cloth with both hands. When they were alone, Mara reached into the packet and pulled free the photograph of Jonah and baby Ben, along with a small brass key on a twine loop. The office safe, she said. Jonah told me once, if ever the wheel stopped, the truth would be in the little things left behind. She laid the key in Gideon's palm. I am done mistaking caution for wisdom. We go public now. All of it. He looked at the key. Rusk still has Pike. He may have the judge. Then we don't take it to one man in a closed room. Her eyes had gone hard again, but not cold. Bright. We take it where he can't buy silence from a crowd. Saturday's grain dividend meeting at the Dry Hollow Freight Warehouse brought every farmer, hauler, widow, and storekeeper within 15 miles, because that was where Rusk settled accounts and set new ones like traps. By noon the warehouse yard was choked with wagons and dust. Men argued over weights. Women held babies on hips and listened harder than their husbands knew. Pike stood on the loading platform, damp and pompous in a clean coat. Rusk, arm in a sling, had the pale fury of a man who had nearly won and resented having to finish the job. Then Mara Quill walked into the yard with Gideon at her side, one arm bound, coat buttoned high over the packet, Ben carrying the brass seal, and Elsie holding the blue cloth like a banner. Ada Loon came behind them. So did Isaiah Bell, and after him Widow Hale, and after her two brothers who had lost 40 acres to altered interest, and after them enough townspeople that the whole place seemed to lean one way. Rusk saw them and smiled too quickly. Miss Quill. Bold, for a fugitive. Mara climbed the platform without asking leave. I came for my name, she said. And everybody else's you wrote crooked. Laughter ran through the crowd, startled and hungry. Pike reached for her arm. Gideon stepped between them. Careful, Sheriff. Whole town's watching. Rusk spread his good hand. Then let them watch truth. This woman stole bank records and attacked my men. She's grieving and confused. We can still show mercy if she returns what isn't hers. Mara turned to the crowd. Anybody here ever wonder why your sacks weighed less on his scale than on your own floor? She pointed to the freight beam standing beside the platform. Anybody ever sign for one bridge note and lose a whole field? Anybody ever pay twice and still owe? Silence. Then Widow Hale lifted her chin. I did. A mutter went through the yard. Mara opened Jonah's ledger. She did not grandstand. She read, name by name, date by date, bushel by bushel. Her voice was clear, carrying over harness jingle and wind. Then she held up one altered bridge note and the duplicate beneath it, the erased line visible where Rusk's interest rate had been changed after signing. Here is my husband's mark, she said. And here is what Mr. Rusk wrote over it after the ink dried. Pike barked, forgery of county paper is a hanging crime. Yes, Mara said, turning to him. It is. Ben stepped forward with the brass seal. Isaiah Bell stepped forward with Pike's dropped transport stamp. Ada Loon called from the crowd. Funny how the sheriff's private seal turns up under a blacksmith's step the same week a widow's records vanish. Heads turned. Pike's face lost all color. Rusk saw the yard shifting and moved to cut it off. Enough. His voice cracked like a whip. I own these contracts. No, Mara said. You hid behind them. She turned, walked to the scale beam, and laid one of Jonah's marked stones on the platform. My husband milled grain for 12 years. So did I? I can tell a false counterweight by sound. Listen. She lifted the official weight from Rusk's scale and dropped it onto the plank. It rang dull. Then she held up Jonah's marked stone and dropped that one. Clean iron sang bright enough to cut through the whole yard. This one is shaved, she said. Filed hollow underneath and packed with lead to cheat by measure. He stole a little from every sack because he knew desperate people count blessings before they count ounces. That did it. Voices rose. Men pushed forward. Women began naming their own figures from memory. Rusk took one step back. Pike went for his pistol. Elsie screamed. Rusk had seized the child by the shoulder and yanked her against his side so fast the crowd gasped as one body. He shoved the pistol under her chin and backed toward the freight hoist, eyes mad now, all polish burned off. Nobody moved. Mara went white, but did not cry out. Gideon's rifle came up. Rusk jerked the gun harder against Elsie's throat. I said nobody. Mara's gaze flicked once, not to his face, not to the gun, but to the hoist rigging above him. Old rope. Rusted brake wheel. Counter sacks hanging loaded on the opposite end. The sort of machinery she had worked half her life. Her breathing slowed. Silas, she said, in the same tone a mother might use coaxing a child away from a ledge. You always did stand too close to the mechanism. He frowned, just enough. Mara moved. Not toward him. Toward the brake post. She hit it low with the iron hook she had tucked under her coat. The rusted catch snapped free. The loaded grain sacks on the far side dropped in a blur. The hoist arm whipped upward. The chain slammed across Rusk's gun wrist with a crack like kindling breaking. He screamed. The pistol flew. Gideon fired once, taking Pike's hand as the sheriff lunged for his own weapon. Isaiah tackled the sheriff clean off the platform. Elsie ran. Rusk tried to follow, but the swinging hoist beam caught him across the chest and drove him to the planks. Before he could rise, Ben was on him with the brass seal raised like a hammer, and then Gideon was there, boot on Rusk's good arm, rifle at his throat. No more children, Gideon said. The crowd surged forward then, not as a mob, but as witnesses finally allowed the shape of the thing they had long suspected. Widow Hale spoke first, then the Hale brothers, then a teamster from the East Road, then a flower widow from Bent Creek with tears in her voice and 20 receipts in her apron pocket. Rusk could buy silence one at a time. He could not buy 100 tongues at once. By dusk his office safe was opened with Jonah's brass key. Inside lay duplicate deeds, false liens, private letters to a rail speculator, and enough stolen notes to bury him under every fence post in the county. Pike was hauled away with both hands bound. Cleet, found half senseless near the burned mill, chose confession over prison labor and named names till the lamplight failed. Silas Rusk lost his bank within 3 days, his cattle within 10, and his freedom before the week was out. The railroad contract passed him by entirely once the survey men learned his title claims were poison. The county auctioned his herd to repay the families he had stripped. Quill Creek and the mill rights reverted not only to Mara, but to a milling cooperative formed by every household he had cheated. That mattered to Mara most. Not that she won, that he did not keep what he took. People are quick to change their voices once danger has passed. The storekeeper who once washed his counter instead of her eyes brought sugar on credit and called it neighborly. Men who had spoken to Jonah, but never to Mara, began asking her rate on winter milling. Women stopped by with sourdough starters, dried apples, bolts of cloth, and the awkward tenderness of people ashamed they had waited so long to be brave. Mara accepted what was useful and ignored the rest. As for Gideon, he offered to leave once his arm healed enough to hold reins proper. He made the offer while mending the mill fence because some men still believe departure is nobler than asking to stay. Mara listened, then handed him a board to steady and said, "If you're going, stop fixing my gate." He looked at her. She drove the nail home with one clean strike. "If you're staying, supper's at dusk." That was the nearest thing to a declaration either of them required. By first wheat of the following year, Quill Mill turned again from dawn into lamplight. Ben had grown 2 inches and still wore seriousness like an oversized coat, but he laughed now without looking startled afterward. Elsie no longer hid food in her pockets. Ada Loon kept a chair by the stove as if she had always belonged there. Isaiah Bell claimed half the new wheel irons were his idea, though everybody knew Mara had drawn them first on butcher paper with floury fingers and no patience for argument. People talk about miracles as though they arrive loud, with thunder behind them. But the ones that last usually come plain and warm and meant to be shared, like bread on a worn table and the hand that sets one extra place without making a speech about it. At sunset, the rebuilt mill will turn slow beside the creek while 5 figures stood in the window above it, passing warm biscuits from a blue cloth through gold light full of swallows. And next time, if you'll join us, we'll tell you about the deaf woman sent to a snowbound ranch because her brothers were ashamed of her, and the blind horse trainer who heard her courage long before anyone else learned how to see it.